At the moment, we have three main peace proposals on the table. One that's been put forward by Zelensky, one by Trump, and one by Russia. So we have the Zelensky formula, and this has been pretty consistent since Istanbul failed. And this represents the Ukrainian maximalist war aims. I put Europe there too because Europe has more or less taken Zelensky's position on this. We have the Trump-Kellogg plan. Keith Kellogg is a general who Trump appointed as special envoy to Ukraine, although Witkoff is doing basically the job that Kellogg was supposed to do. And he came up with a plan last year, and Trump's basically take that, tweaked it a bit, and that is the peace proposal they have on the table. And then they have the Russian plan, which was laid out by Putin in his speech to the Russian Foreign Ministry last June. So we're just going to go through the three plans and compare them on the main points, and I'll try to indicate where there might be room for compromise and where there's no room for compromise. So the overall flexibility of the position. Now, the Zelensky plan is 100% no compromises, but Zelensky is very slippery, and he will change or reword things depending on who he's talking to. So if he thinks supporting a ceasefire will get him more money or will keep the Americans on side, he will say that. If he's afraid that he's going to get assassinated, he will say the opposite. I think you should treat Zelensky's demands as basically 100% set in stone, but he will obfuscate and use language to try to get around that. The Trump-Kellogg plan is very much up in the air. There's a lot of internal division. You have Witkoff, Vance, and Tulsi on one side, who are more towards just accepting Putin's proposal and moving on. And then you have Rubio, Kellogg, and Walz, who are more on the Ukrainian side of things. So they may change their position, but there's a lot of infighting within the Trump administration. They're probably the only party who might actually change their demands. Then we have Russia, and this represents their minimalist goals. You hear it called the maximalist goals in the West, but this is the absolute minimum that they will accept to end the war. Okay, so the status of negotiations. So there is a law that Zelensky put into effect that bans negotiations with Russia. It is actually illegal for Ukraine to negotiate with Russia. I forget the exact terms. I think it's as long as Putin's president. But they have said we will not have negotiations until Russia fully withdraws and I think Putin steps down. So the negotiations would be under the level of reparations Russia would have to pay. Trump supports negotiations with Russia, and Russia has always supported negotiations. So Ukraine is the outlier on that one. And until they remove that law, which Zelensky has basically given no intention of doing so, they can't actually have the negotiations. It's just, it kind of sinks the whole thing from the start. Next, we have the status of the ceasefire. So Ukraine will go back and forth on this. At some points, they'll say, yes, we want an immediate ceasefire. Sometimes they'll say, okay, we can have a ceasefire after Russia's left all of our territory. It very much depends on who they're talking to, the day of the week, and if Zelensky thinks he can get something out of it. Recently, with the Easter ceasefire, they agreed to it but took the opportunity to launch some small offensives and retake some territory. So I could see Zelensky pushing for a ceasefire so that he would kind of give him a bit of breathing room and then he can rebuild and go on an offensive again. The Trump-Kellogg plan calls for an immediate unconditional ceasefire on both sides, and Russia has said we will have a ceasefire only after the root causes is resolved. That is, we will agree to a ceasefire, but only after we have a signed treaty. We're not going to let this turn into another frozen conflict that's going to drag on for decades. Okay, so next we have the issue of NATO/EU membership. Zelensky demands immediate membership to both NATO and the EU. Keep in mind, even if he had the right to join NATO, there's no guarantee that NATO would actually let him join, but he demands immediate entry. The Trump-Kellogg plan initially was 10 to 20 years will put off entry of Ukraine into NATO, but they've played around with that a bit, and now there's a vague promise that Ukraine will never join NATO. I don't think they say anything about the EU. There's not going to be a treaty because they don't have the votes for that in Congress. It's not going to be legally binding. There's not going to be any enforcement mechanisms. It's just kind of a handshake agreement. And Russia's demand is a legally binding guarantee with enforcement mechanisms that Ukraine will never join NATO, and I'm pretty sure the EU as well at this point. And I should just point out that this is a 100% thing that neither side will compromise on. Ukraine has said they will never compromise on NATO membership, and Russia has said that they will never compromise on NATO membership. So the two positions are, even just this far in, incompatible, and there's no way that either side would accept this deal. Okay, the question of European soldiers. Zelensky and Starmer and Macron and the coalition of the willing demand immediate deployment of soldiers to Ukraine. I don't know if that's to fight Russia, if that's to act as peacekeepers or whatever, but they want immediate deployment. The Trump-Kellogg plan, Kellogg had intended European soldiers to be deployed there after the treaty was signed and a ceasefire had come into effect. That seems to be where they are at the moment. I think it's more they don't really have an opinion on it, and the Europeans can kind of do whatever they want. Russia's position is no foreign troops in Ukraine ever. Okay, we have the issue of territory. Ukraine insists on 1991 borders. That is everything that was part of Ukraine prior to Crimea being annexed and the Donbass seceding in 2014 will be returned to Ukraine. Sometimes, depending on who they're talking to, they'll say, oh, well, we'll temporarily accept the occupation, but eventually we'll take it back, but we'll never acknowledge that it's part of Russia. It's very much up in the air. In practice, though, this is a hard demand. Every square inch of Ukrainian territory needs to be restored to the 1991 borders. If that is not the agreement, they will not agree to it. The Trump-Kellogg plan is to formally recognize Crimea as part of Russia and accept the indefinite Russian occupation along the current lines. I think there might be part of the Kellogg plan, I think, makes them give up a little bit of territory to get kind of a sane front line, but they're just going to de facto accept Russian occupation of this territory, but de jure recognize Crimea as kind of a bribe. Russia's demand, and this is once again non-negotiable, formally recognize Crimea and the four administrative boundaries of the four regions, Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk, and Luhansk, as part of Russia. So Ukraine would have to vacate the parts of those territories they still control. They would have to sign a treaty acknowledging those as Russian territory. Once again, Putin has said because of the Russian constitution, these parts are legally part of Russia now, and even if he wanted to, he couldn't give them up. And Zelensky has said the same thing. So once again, complete non-starter. Okay, we have the issue of the Russian government. A core part of the Zelensky formula is that there has to be regime change in Russia. Putin has to be removed from office somehow. And there needs to be a new government, and there needs to be war crimes tribunals and reparations. And Europe and Zelensky have talked about breaking up Russia. Trump and Russia, obviously, Trump thinks that this is ridiculous. They don't even really give it lip service or even talk about it. Russia obviously does not want regime change in Russia. Now, with regards to Ukraine's government, Zelensky wants to continue on, obviously, as is. The Americans want them to hold elections. It may be like loosen up some of the restrictions they placed on civilians. And the Russians want complete regime change, including the disarmament and disbanding of ultranationalist paramilitaries, kind of a purge of ultranationalist elements from the Ukrainian government and military, and restrictions on propaganda and just other anti-Russian activities. There's the issue of military size and further Russian support. Both America and Ukraine want there to be no limit on Ukraine's military, and they want to allow Ukraine to receive as much military aid from the West as they want. Russia wants forced restrictions on Ukraine so it'll never have an army big enough to threaten it again, and they want no further military aid. And so the final one, and this is something that the U.S. and Western commentators tend to just forget about and not even really like acknowledge. They think that this is like a joke or something Putin had. The issue of Russian minority rights. So Zelensky has basically said there will be no compromises on this. We're going to continue Ukrainianization of the areas. That is restrictions on the Russian language, the Russian Orthodox Church, just various efforts to try to forcibly assimilate the Russian minority into the majority by coercion or force if necessary. Also, the ultranationalist groups are they go and do their own thing in areas with significant Russian populations. Anyways, so America has just ignored this. And they said, look, Ukraine, Zelensky told me that they were nice to the Russians living there, that they would never harm them, that they were good boys who didn't do anything. So everything is good, and there's no need for any kind of compromise. Putin has said that there needs to be protection for the Russian language, maybe official bilingualism, an end to the ban on the Russian Orthodox Church, other cultural organizations and news organizations and stuff that they banned, and that there are certain autonomy and rights for the Russian areas, and they will not cease undergoing forced Ukrainization. And once again, that is also non-negotiable, really, for Zelensky and for Russia. That was one of their initial war aims, was to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. So Zelensky and the people who back him will never accept rights for the rights that they want for Russian minorities. Russia will never accept that. They will not accept that. And I think Trump just doesn't really care or know about it, or it's not really an issue. So that is my attempt at a brief summary of the three main negotiating positions. As you can see, the Trump-Kellogg one is an attempt at a compromise, albeit I think it's one that leans a lot more towards Ukraine than it does towards Russia. It does represent progress, as Biden used to hold to the Zelensky plan. But it's completely unacceptable to both Russia and Zelensky. They're both going to reject it. Zelensky has already rejected it. So we'll see what the U.S. does, if they just walk away at this point, if they change their proposal. This is just summarizing the position, so I'm not going to go into what I think everybody's going to do in this video. Hopefully that gives you a better idea of where we're at. People were asking for a summary, and I thought that was a good idea rather than just making you go through the entirety of a 40-minute video. If you're interested, though, in more detail about this and what I think is going to happen, go watch that video too. So God bless everybody, and I'll talk to you again real soon.